Before the summer rains came to the Sonoran Desert, a woman named Marta climbed a ladder to the flat roof of her home and checked the baskets. There were 3 of them up there, each one taller than a child, woven from branches and sealed shut with dried mud. Inside was the year. Not money. Food. Pods, thousands of them, picked from the low, thorny trees along the wash while they were still dry, because once the rains hit, the wet ones would spoil. She had timed the harvest to beat the weather by about a week. The pods were long and pale and faintly sweet, and when you cracked one open, it smelled like cinnamon and cocoa and something close to honey. Ground fine on stone, they became a flour the color of sand. Pressed into hard cakes, that flour would keep for years without a cellar, without ice, without a single jar. 1 good roof, 3 good baskets, and a family of 6 could eat straight through a bad season and into the next harvest. This was the staple, the thing the whole year leaned on, gathered by the ton across the desert southwest and stored on rooftops from the Gila River to the Gulf. And the tree that made it is one you have almost certainly stood next to, without once thinking of it as food. Its name is mesquite. The kind Marta stored is honey mesquite, and botanists write it as Prosopis glandulosa. Prosopis glandulosa, though the field recently moved it into a genus called Neltuma. In the Sonoran borderlands, it is the algarobo. Along the Gila River, the Acumel otham, harvested the pods by the millions of pounds. Farther west, the kawia, built entire pantries around them. Today, the tree grows on roughly 56 million acres of Texas alone. You have driven past it 1,000 times. So here is the honest version, before we go any further. Mesquite is real, and its pods really did feed desert families for thousands of years as a sweet, slow-digesting flour. That part of the story holds up under every source I could open. But 2 things in the title do not survive contact with the evidence. No one has proven this sugar heals a disease, and the plant was never actually erased. It did not vanish. We reclassified it. We took a food that fed people here for longer than the United States has existed, and we filed it under weed. How that happened is stranger than any cover story, and it begins with the thing that made the pods worth storing in the first place: the sweetness. And hold on to that roof in those 3 baskets. We come back to them at the very end. Start with what the pods actually were to the people who lived on them. In 1871, a government agent named Frederick Grossman recorded the Otham and their neighbors along the Gila gathering mesquite pods by the millions of pounds in a single season. This was not foraging around the edges of a cornfield. 2 anthropologists, Bell and Castetter, writing in 1937, called mesquite the principal wild food along the lower Colorado and Gila rivers, and suggested it may have mattered more than maize itself until fairly recently. The Pima called it the tree of life, and they meant that literally, the way you would mean it about a grain silo. The work of turning pods into food was specific and hard-won. The kawia roasted the flour spikes into balls and pounded the ripe pods in deep wooden mortars until the sweet pulp broke down into meal. Then they moistened that meal and pressed it into cakes that hardened as they dried. Those cakes, sometimes shaped into rough loaves people later nicknamed mesquite turtles, would sit on a shelf for years and still be good. In a desert with no refrigeration, a flour that could last that long without spoiling was worth more than almost anything else people could make. The pods fed more than one appetite, too. Across the Southwest and down into South America, communities soaked and fermented the sweet pulp into a mild beverage, one more use squeezed out of a single season's harvest. Here is a detail that tells you how seriously they took it. They pounded the pods in mortars instead of grinding them flat on the stone metates they use for corn. And the reason is chemistry. Mesquite pulp is so sugary that on a flat grinding stone it turns sticky and gums up the surface. The mortar and pestle got around that. The seeds themselves were a different problem. They are hard enough to break a tooth, so people often parched them or set them aside rather than fight them. Every step of the process worked around the plant's stubborn design, and people did it anyway, for centuries, because the payoff was a year of food that would not rot. The pod earns that effort on paper, too. A dissertation out of Texas Tech measured whole honey mesquite pods at around 82% carbohydrate, close to 11% protein, and about 26% fiber, with the seed alone running above 40% protein. That is a serious food, not a novelty. And the flavor was the reward that made it worth climbing to the roof for. Extension descriptions and the people who still harvest it talk about honey, about cocoa and coffee and hazelnut, a flat caramel sweetness with a nutty edge. The purple-streaked pods, the harvesters say, tend to be the sweetest of all. The tree gave more than food, which is part of why it sat so close to the center of desert life. Its sticky sap could be boiled into a chewy candy, worked into a glue, cooked down into a black paint for decorating pottery, or smeared onto woven baskets to waterproof them. The wood made tools, fence posts, and some of the best cooking fuel in the region. A single tree was a pantry, a hardware store, and a woodpile at once. So the pods were sweet, they were dense with calories, and they stored almost forever. Now remember one word for this next part: sucrose. Because the sweetness is exactly where the modern legend runs ahead of the science. The story you will hear in wellness videos is that mesquite is a magic sugar, low on the glycemic scale, full of a special fructose the body can handle without insulin. Some of that is true, and the true parts are genuinely interesting. Other parts are simply wrong in a way that matters for anyone taking it as medical advice. Take the glycemic part first, because it holds up. In 1990, researchers led by Jeanette Brand fed 25-gram carbohydrate portions of 6 traditional Pima foods, mesquite among them, to a small group of volunteers and measured what happened to their blood sugar. Every one of those foods produced a low glycemic response, landing across a range from about 16 to about 40, well under white bread or corn. That is a real finding, and it fits everything we know about the fiber in the pod. Mesquite flour is loaded with soluble fiber, including a gum in the same family as gum arabic, the kind of fiber that slows digestion down. A slow, steady release of sugar instead of a spike. That part is measured and real. But read the fine print on that study, because it is the fine print the ads never show you. There were 8 people in it, and every one of them was healthy. Not a single diabetic was tested. It measured how fast sugar entered the blood in people whose bodies already handled sugar well. It did not test whether mesquite treats, prevents, or reverses any disease, and it never claimed to. Now the part that is simply wrong. The special insulin-free fructose does not exist. When chemists actually analyzed honey and velvet mesquite back in 1980, they found no fructose to speak of. The sweetness is sucrose. Ordinary table sugar is sucrose. In the South American cousin used for commercial flour, more than 9 parts in 10 of the simple sugar is that same plain sucrose. So the pod is sweet the way a date is sweet, wrapped in enough fiber to slow it down, and that is genuinely useful. It simply is not a sugar that plays by different rules once it is inside your body. There is one more layer of research worth naming because it is where the frontier actually is, and because it is the easiest thing in the world to overstate. In recent lab work, scientists ground mesquite pods into extracts and pulled out specific molecules and peptides, then tested those isolated compounds in test tubes and in computer models against the enzymes that break down starch and sugar. Some of those isolated compounds did slow those enzymes down in the dish. That is a promising signal. But a molecule in a test tube is not a bowl of flour on your table. And the researchers themselves said so. Their conclusion was that mesquite has potential as a functional ingredient, which is careful scientist language for, we found something worth studying, not, we found a cure. No animal ate it, no person ate it, nothing about that lab result tells you what happens when you actually eat the pod, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. So it is sweet, it is slow, and it is full of fiber. That much is measured. Everything past that line gets thin fast. And here is the part the wellness ads leave out, so I am going to say it plainly, because it is the single strongest piece of evidence against the whole premise of this video. The sweetness in mesquite is mostly sucrose, the same thing sitting in your sugar bowl. Peter Felker, a scientist who spent years importing and studying mesquite flour, and probably knew it better than anyone alive, put it about as bluntly as a researcher can. He said he would love to be able to say it helps diabetes, but being a scientist first, he could not. The best human study anyone cites used 8 healthy people. So if you came to this video for a sugar that heals, the most honest answer I can give you is that we do not have that evidence. And the man who knew the flour best told you so himself. Which leaves the real mystery, and it is a better story than the fake one. If this pod was a genuine staple food for thousands of years, dense, sweet, storable, sitting on a tree that grows almost anywhere in the Southwest. How did it end up as something people pay to destroy? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is cattle. Before the 1800s, mesquite was here, but it was scattered, mostly hugging the stream banks in the deep soils. Then came the great cattle drives, and everything changed for the tree. Cows eat mesquite pods, and the hard seeds pass through them undamaged and scarified, planted across the open range in a pat of ready-made fertilizer. Overgrazing stripped away the tall grasses that had competed with mesquite seedlings and had once fueled the prairie fires that kept the young trees in check. Take away the grass, take away the fire, and add a herd of animals spreading seed everywhere they walk, and the tree that used to line the washes marched out across the whole country. By the early 1900s, ranchers had a problem, because a pasture turning into a mesquite thicket grows less grass for cattle. The pods that had fed families were now, in the eyes of the range, just shade the cows could not eat. The reaction was total war. Organized control began in the 1920s and 30s. By 1964, a pair of range scientists were calling mesquite the most common and widespread noxious plant in Texas. What followed was decades of chaining, where two tractors drag a giant anchor chain between them to rip trees out by the roots, plus grubbing, shredding, and wave after wave of aerial herbicide. The same land-grant universities that had once cataloged this pod as a food crop now publish a step-by-step guide called How to Beat Mesquite. In one 10-year stretch, a single Texas state agency treated something on the order of 300,000 hectares of it. Nationally, around the middle of the 1980s, the losses blamed on mesquite were pegged at somewhere between $200 million and $500 million a year. Sit with the shape of that. The very traits that made mesquite a survival food, the deep roots, the flood of sweet pods, the refusal to die, are the exact traits that got it condemned as a weed. The tree never failed at anything. It did precisely what a tough desert tree is built to do. It did it across an entire state, and doing its job that well is what got it sprayed. So that is the machine that turned a food into a weed. Cattle, fire, a herbicide budget, and an economy that valued grass over pods. And this is the part I want to be careful about, because it is easy to spin into something it is not. No government agency and no company set out to bury a healing food. Mesquite fell out of the pantry because a cattle economy valued grass over pods, and because the indigenous foodways that centered the plant were pushed aside by generations of assimilation. It was demoted by market logic, not by a plot. Nobody hid the flower. The knowledge of how to make it faded as the people who carried it were pushed to the margins, and the spraying rolled in behind the silence. If you think that is a uniquely American way to misunderstand a plant, look at what the rest of the world did with the same genus, because the split is almost comic. In Peru, the very same kind of tree is treasured. There they call it the algarobo, and its long pods are boiled down into a dark syrup called algarobina, thick and sweet, poured into cocktails and desserts, and sold on grocery shelves as a point of national pride. A university in the city of Piura has been industrializing those pods since 1984. The wood makes the prized charcoal that grills the country's rotisserie chicken. In Hawaii, a close relative naturalized so well it became one of the island's major honey sources. And then there is the other half of the world, where the same tree became a nightmare. In India, a hardy, invasive cousin spread so aggressively after the British planted it that people gave it a nickname that means, roughly, the mad tree, and courts eventually ordered campaigns to clear it. In the Afar region of Ethiopia, it has swallowed more than 1 million hectares of grazing land, spreading relentlessly every year, and the herders there call it the devil tree. In parts of Kenya, when researchers surveyed people living with the plant, clear majorities said their lives would be better if it had never arrived. In Australia, it has taken more than 800,000 hectares of pastoral country and sits on the official worst weed lists. It is the same tree in all of these places. People just decided completely opposite things about it. There is a smaller irony closer to home, and you have probably paid for it. The one part of the mesquite tree that Americans still buy on purpose is the smoke. Walk into any hardware store and you will find bags of mesquite barbecue pellets and chips, about $23 for a 20-pound bag, sold to throw a sweet smoke over your brisket. We burn the wood of a tree for flavor, while the sweet, edible pods it grows every summer fall to the ground and rot a few feet away, uncollected. Which brings the story to now, and to the small number of people trying to remember what the pod was for. On the Tohono O'odham Nation, Tohono O'odham, the San Xavier Cooperative Farm harvests and sells wild-gathered mesquite flower, keeping a food and a skill alive at the same time. In Tucson, the seed conservation group Native Seeds Search stocks it. One grower in Arizona has brought in thousands of pounds of pods in a single season to mill. And the genetics are not going anywhere. The National Seed Bank, run by the United States government, holds more than 600,000 plant accessions in cold storage, mesquite among them. So even in the strange event that every tree fell, the seed would still exist. If you want to try it yourself, a few things matter. And the first one is identification. Mesquite is a thorny legume with feathery, fern-like leaves, straight paired spines, and long, leathery pods. And it blooms in spring, often with a second flush after the summer rains, with the pods ripening from around midsummer into early fall. But be careful, because not every tree people call mesquite is a food tree. The ornamental Chilean mesquite and its hybrids, planted all over southwestern yards and parking lots, produce pods that run astringent and are not considered edible. Taste before you gather, and gather from the sweet ones. The preparation is where the plant fights back, exactly the way it fought the people who first ate it. You use the whole dry pod, and you have to grind it in a mortar or a real hammer mill, not a kitchen flour grinder, because those rock-hard seeds and the woody inner pod will wreck ordinary equipment and can crack a tooth. Timing matters even more, and this is the one safety point I want you to actually remember. Harvest ripe pods dry, off the branch, before the summer rains, and never off wet ground. A mold called Aspergillus flavus grows on damp mesquite pods and produces aflatoxin, a genuine toxin, and University of Arizona researchers found the contamination rises right along with rainfall. That is not folklore. There is a documented, scientific reason the old harvest always beat the monsoon by a week, exactly the way Marta timed hers. Even commercial mesquite flour has been recalled once for a bacterial contamination, so if you are buying it, buy from someone who handles it carefully. And if you have a legume allergy, treat mesquite like the bean family plant it is, and be cautious. A word on where you stand, legally and ethically. Across the United States Southwest, harvesting mesquite pods is perfectly legal, but remember that the official machinery treats the tree as brush to be killed, rather than a crop to be grown. And in places like Australia and Hawaii, it is a declared noxious weed. So what is legal in Arizona is a different matter overseas. And even where the pods are abundant, do not strip a tree bare. Those pods feed wildlife and livestock, and one relative, the screwbean mesquite, is actually in local decline in parts of its range. Leave plenty. And never harvest from roadside trees or ones that have been sprayed with the very herbicides half this story was about. Which brings us back to Marta's roof and the 3 sealed baskets that held a year of food. That roof is gone now, and in most places, so is the knowledge that filled it. The tree is not gone. It stands on more land than it ever has. The pods still fall every summer, still sweet, still keeping for years the way they always have, mostly onto ground where nobody bothers to gather them. A food did not disappear. The people who knew it as food did. So if you ever want to meet the oldest flower in the desert, walk the next dry wash you pass in late summer, find the long pale pods on a sweet potted tree, and taste one. That flat, honeyed sweetness is still dropping onto the ground every summer, in most places waiting on a harvest that no longer comes. If you found this worth your time, subscribe, because I go looking for one of these forgotten plants every single week. And if you liked this video, YouTube also thinks you're going to like this one on your screen.